This is hell.
Identity politics are not what they used to be. They've been co-opted and controlled by politics that are the exact opposite of what the originators of identity politics believed. Here to explain, Asad Haider, author of Mistaken Identity, Race and Class in the Age of Trump. Welcome to This Is Hell, Asad.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Asad is a founding editor of Viewpoint Magazine, a fantastic publication, an investigative journal of contemporary politics, and this is far more cool. Asad is a PhD candidate in the history of consciousness at UC Santa Cruz and a member of UAW 2865, the Student Workers Union at the University of California, and that might be the best part of any bio I have ever read on this show, Asad. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
All right, so let me ask you first. Oh, yeah, here we are. I'm all over the place with my notes today. You write that in 1977, the term identity politics in its contemporary form was introduced into political discourse by the Combahee River Collective, the CRC, a group of black lesbian militants, including founding members Barbara Smith, Beverly Smith, and Demita Frazee, who wrote the influential collective text, A Black Feminist Statement. They did not believe politics should be reduced to the specific identities of the individuals engaged in it. As Barbara Smith has recently reflected, what we were saying is that we have a right as people who are not just female, who are not solely black, who are not just lesbians, who are not just working class or workers, that we are people who embody all of these identities, and we have a right to build and define political theory and practice based upon that reality. That's what we meant by identity politics. We didn't mean that if you're not the same as us, you're nothing. We were not saying that we didn't care about anybody who wasn't exactly like us. To what degree were identity politics meant to be inclusive, and to what degree are today's identity politics, in your opinion, exclusive?
Well, it's hard to get any clearer than Barbara Smith was there in that interview. What she's pointing to is the fact that her organization at the beginning was founded by people who had participated in a number of coalitions and a number of different left organizations. And they came out of that with the understanding that particular kinds of reductive understandings of identity had severely limited the emancipatory potential of those movements. So a feminist movement which conceives of all women as being white, a black liberation movement which conceives of all black people as being men. These were very limiting kinds of identities. And of course, the classical example being a labor movement which conceives of all workers as being white men. So these reductive identities prevented these movements from really achieving the goals of emancipation that they had set out. And so the idea of identity politics, as they had originally conceived of it, was that their specific identity as black women was the one that was excluded from these hegemonic identities. And so by asserting their right to organize autonomously, to have their own agency, they were breaking that kind of structure of exclusion. And they were bringing out the possibility of undermining all the existing structures of oppression, which is why they say in that statement, if black women become free, then everyone becomes free, because that means undermining the very structure that lies at the core of everyone's oppression.
This, by the way, I just want to say your book was fascinating because this has been a topic that we've been talking about a lot on the show. And you quote Demita Frazee recalling the emphasis the Combahee organization placed on coalitions, saying, I never believed that Combahee or other black feminist groups I've participated in should focus only on issues of concern for us as black women or that as lesbian, bisexual women. We should only focus on lesbian issues. It's really important to note that Combahee was instrumental in founding a local battered women's shelter. We worked in coalition with community activists, women and men, lesbians and straight folks. We were very active in the reproductive rights movement, even though at the time most of us were lesbians. We found ourselves involved in coalition with the labor movement because we believed in the importance of supporting other groups. Even if the individuals in that group weren't all feminist, we understood that coalition building was crucial to our own survival. Why do we have the sense then that identity politics today is exclusive, working within a vacuum outside of any politics other than those that affect and are about their identity first and foremost?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons. One is simply the fact that social movements have been fragmented and largely defeated since the late 70s in most of the advanced capitalist world. And that's something that has to do with the restructuring of capitalism that came with neoliberalism. It has to do with what Stuart Hall called the authoritarian populism of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And we don't have a base of mass movements that sort of train people in the practice of coalition. And one thing to note is that coalitions show you that identities are not fixed things, that you can't reduce people to their identities, and you can't reduce politics to anybody's identity. In fact, Kimberlé Crenshaw, who is well known for introducing the term intersectionality, she points out in one of the articles that elaborates on the term that even just what we consider to be a unitary identity group is in itself already a coalition, because it's already composed of all kinds of people who are defined and determined by a multiplicity of traits, even if you've just defined them according to one trait. And so right now, since we've lost an anchor in mass movements, we've lost the idea that politics should be driven from below rather than just being a contestation between two different leaders of an elite mainstream political party. We've lost that idea, and we've come to rely on very reductive understandings of our identities, because that's become the way that we gain access to our politics. That's by asserting our particular identities and claiming to be injured on the basis of our identities, we can demand protection or recognition from the state. And that's what our politics has been reduced to when we lose that connection to mass movement.
So how much then do identity politics limit our identity? And are we doing that to ourselves simply because that, as you were just saying, is the only way that we can have an impact on the political system as it stands right now?
Well, I think that the sort of reductive understanding of identity that is very prevalent now, which reduces politics to just an expression of who you are, and who you are can be determined in many different ways. And even if you have an intersectional understanding of who you are, the idea that that somehow determines the way that you think politically or the way that you act politically is a highly misleading way of understanding politics. Because we know that many people who come from marginalized identities can be absorbed into the existing power structure and can engage in the kind of political practice, the kind of policy making that's highly destructive to the communities that they are either coming out of or now claiming to represent. There are many examples of this, and we just had 8 years of an example with Barack Obama. Why is it that the Black Lives Matter movement had to arise under the regime of the first black president? That's an indication that the identity of an individual politician doesn't lead to structural political change. Even if this was a major turning point, but the fact that it came to be seen as a substitute for mass movements is why Black Lives Matter had to happen. Something had to happen from below to actually challenge the persistence of racism that so many people had assumed was adequately challenged by the election of a black politician.
How much, then, is Black Lives Matter reclaiming the Combahee River Collective's meaning, the original meaning of identity politics as a collectivist response to the problems of capitalism that we have today?
I think that it was a movement with many different tendencies, and it has gone through a particular kind of evolution and has faced the challenges that social movements face in the United States. I think that there was, in a strong sense, a return to the kind of mass-based coalitional practice of the Combahee River Collective. I don't know what direction that's taking now and what direction it will take in the future. And it's just as before in the Black Freedom Movement, there were many different tendencies, and some led in that kind of coalitional, emancipatory, mass organizing direction, and others led in an elite leadership kind of direction that often rationalized itself with ideologies of racial unity, the reductive, essentialist kinds of understandings of identity, and those exist now too. And so, in any social movement, you see contradictions and antagonisms, and it's important to recognize those, I think.
And we'll get back to that idea of a black misleadership class, as Black Agenda Reports, Glenn Ford calls it. But you write for the Combahee River Collective, feminist political practice meant, for example, walking picket lines during strikes in the building trades during the 1970s. But the history that followed seemed to turn the whole thing upside down. Then you quote historian Salar Mahandesi, explaining what began as a promise to push beyond some of socialism's limitations to build a richer, more diverse, and inclusive socialist politics ended up exploited by those with politics diametrically opposed to those of the CRC. What were the politics of those who co-opted the CRC and the CRC's call for a more inclusive socialist politics and turned it into a more exclusive identity politics? Who co-opted those identity politics?
Well, I mean, the history that takes us through the 80s and 90s in terms of the use of these words, identity politics, is a really complicated one, which is going to take another book to explain. But I think that the term saw a real mainstream resurgence with the 2016 primaries, and I sort of make a jump, a historical jump, in order to show the instability of the term. That is, that it was introduced as a kind of emancipatory radical term, and recently, with a lot of the discourse around the Hillary Clinton campaign and the opposition to the Bernie Sanders campaign, it was used as a way specifically to undermine any challenge to the hegemonic ideas of the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And in this context, it became totally uprooted from its origins. And I think we could identify two different ways that people meant the word or the term. One would be that it's just anything that has to do with race and gender, which is either seen in opposition to class or seen as something that has to be added to class or something of that kind. And then the other was the one that we've already been discussing, which is that your politics sort of emerges from the foundation of your identity. And, every time the term was used in the mainstream media, in think pieces and so on, it seemed to take on a different meaning, sometimes different meanings within the same article. But neither of these meanings obviously was resonant with the very specific kind of meaning that the Combahee River Collective had. So I think that the way that it's become a kind of floating term now has allowed it to be used in a kind of weaponized way in order to attack political adversaries. And the fact that Hillary Clinton represented a continuation of the kind of neoliberal and militarist legacy of not just the Obama years, but also the preceding Bush years and the Bill Clinton years before that, that became suppressed, that was hidden underneath the discourse of identity politics and the equation of identity politics with some kind of civil rights agenda. And so the 2016 primaries were in many respects a turning point, in that a politics that had to do with opposing racism and sexism became separated and even turned into an opposition to a politics that was about overcoming economic inequality. And that's not how it was conceived before.
Did the Hillary Clinton campaign then weaponize identity politics?
Well, I mean, Hillary Clinton made these tweets about privilege, used the word intersectionality. So there was some direct appropriation. Her communications director, who I quote in the book, said I think on MSNBC, it's all about identity on our side now. And I think a lot of pundits, a lot of people in the mainstream media really adopted that language, often explicitly using the term identity politics as a way to say that, I think I'm far to the left of Bernie Sanders, but one of the significant things about the Sanders campaign was that it presented a challenge to the existing political discourse in this country. It introduced a lot of young people to the word socialism. It introduced the idea that you could have a political agenda that was not simply reduced to reshuffling the existing economic and political elites. And that was something that the Hillary Clinton campaign and the liberal intellectuals and intelligentsia were trying very hard to suppress.
So how much does the identity politics as defined by the Hillary Clinton campaign, how much does it support or endorse the idea of the elite? How much does it help, how much does it feed into the idea of an elite?
Well, it's absolutely a kind of politics which revolves around individuals, and the identity politics is understood to be an expression of the rights of an individual according to their particular identity, and that means that achieving, as I was saying about Obama, and the same holds true of Clinton. Achieving any kind of victory against racism or sexism means diversifying the ruling elite. And that doesn't do anything for the mass of working people who belong to one of these particular identities, however they're conceived. I mean, the kinds of programs that are required for overcoming racism and sexism are programs of structural change, and they're programs that will involve also economic change, though they're certainly not restricted to it. But none of that change can be achieved by diversifying the ruling elite. The ruling elite itself has to be challenged.
How much does identity politics fail to address institutionalized racism?
Well, it's a significant. There's first of all this factor of the individualization that I was just talking about.
Right.
Second, there's a sense in which understanding race in identity terms reproduces the kinds of ideological categories that are created by racism. And what we have to understand is that race is socially constructed, and it's constructed by racism. It's a central part of American history, which I go into in my book. It comes out of the sort of complicated transformations in migrant forced labor in all the way back to the 17th century in colonial Virginia, the formation of racial slavery, the changing in categories of indentured servitude. That's the kind of history that the categories of race come out of. And if we understand race as just an attribute of a person, something that we can just see based on the color of skin or something, or other physical characteristics, we're reproducing the racist discourse that was invented to rationalize racial oppression. We're reproducing the kind of pseudoscience that European colonialists were using to justify their domination of the non-Western world. And so one of the things that we really need to do in order to oppose racism is break out of this kind of racial ideology and understand how race is historically, socially constructed.
Is the way identity politics are applied today and applied during the Hillary Clinton campaign a way in which class issues can be erased and dismiss critiques of neoliberal globalized capitalism?
Yes, but I think also, I think that identity now, I think that the way that the Combahee River Collective talked about identity politics was a specific intervention into a specific situation that they encountered in mass movements and political practice. I think that identity as a general category to explain race and gender is not adequate. These are really specific social relations with really specific histories, and you have to look at them in their specificity and not subsume them into some general thing called identity. And to just have a kind of list of race, gender, and class, as though these were all different, parallel or intersecting lines, that doesn't adequately understand how any of them operate and how they are articulated together into one society, how they're connected into one social structure. That kind of way of reifying these categories, of turning them into kind of empty abstractions, that's how this opposition gets created between race and gender on the one hand and class on the other, or turning class into an identity in itself. None of these things should be understood that way. What we actually have to do is look at the society as it exists, and look at the relations that constitute it, and look at the ways that they come together into one social structure, and then we'll find that it's never in isolation. You never have racism in isolation from economic exploitation and inequality. You never have racism in opposition from particular patriarchal understandings of the family, for example. These things are part of one process, one historical process, and one social structure. And so by turning them into empty abstractions, it then becomes possible to pit them against class. But that doesn't explain any of these things, and it doesn't help us to tackle any of these problems.
We are speaking with Asad Haider. He is author of Mistaken Identity, Race and Class in the Age of Trump. You can go to our website, thisishell.com, and click on the title of the book, and it takes you directly to the publisher's website where you can purchase the book. You write, as the historian Jacqueline Dowd Hall elaborates in her analysis of the long civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. has been rendered an empty symbol, frozen in 1963. Through selective quotation, Hall observes the uplifting rhetoric of his speeches have been stripped of its content, his opposition to the Vietnam War through an analysis linking segregation to imperialism, his democratic socialist commitment to unionization, his orchestration of the Poor People's Campaign, and his support for a sanitation workers' strike when he was assassinated in Memphis. How does this stripping of the content of King's speeches and writing undermine the more inclusive identity politics of, say, the Black Panthers, who at the time, according to Black Panther leader Kathleen Cleaver, you quote writing, "We organized the Rainbow Coalition, pulled together our allies, including not only the Puerto Rican Young Lords, the youth gang called Black Pea Stone Rangers, the Chicano Brown Berets, and the Asian Red Guards, but also the predominantly white Peace and Freedom Party and the Appalachian Young Patriots Party. We posed not only a theoretical but a practical challenge to the way our world was organized, and we were men and women working together." How does the stripping of content from King's words undermine the idea of identity politics that offer a collective response?
Well, one thing that shows you is that really across the spectrum, I mean, you named two different, you named on the one hand Martin Luther King, who's associated with the classical civil rights movement, and then the Black Panthers, who are associated with Black Power, and they're usually put in opposition. And to a large extent, they were in opposition over tactics and strategy, over the question of violence and so on. But one thing that they really had in common was the understanding of the Black freedom movement of the United States as part of a global movement against colonialism and capitalism. And what they shared fundamentally was an understanding that the movement against racism in the United States also had to be a movement against economic exploitation. It had to be a socialist movement. Both Martin Luther King and the Black Panther Party use this word explicitly. Now, the fact that these figures are invoked today as representing, and both of them are. I mean, you find references to Martin Luther King have become mainstream. Of course, Martin Luther King Day was signed into law by Ronald Reagan, and the Black Panthers were often referred to even by the kind of more elite, neoliberally oriented kinds of opportunistic people who took up Black Lives Matter as a way to launch a kind of personal political career. the fact that these people that King and the Black Panthers talked about socialism gets completely erased, and that's a very, I think, you can see uh, in some cases that's a very deliberate strategy, but it has a very powerful effect on people who have not had access to this kind of information. Obviously, this is not what gets taught in schools. We don't get taught that Martin Luther King was talking about democratic socialism, was calling for a general strike in support of the sanitation workers in Atlanta just before he died, that he supported the Vietnamese struggle for self-determination. We don't get a history of the Black Panther Party that tells us about how they raised money by selling copies of the Little Red Book, about how they conceived of the Free Breakfast for Children program as a program of socialist political education. These are things that we need to learn, and we need to revive that tradition. We need to disseminate that information because it's very valuable, because it tells us about what the struggle against racism in the United States actually was and what it has to continue to be.
You write organizations like the NAACP, led by the elites of the black community, had tried to distance themselves from the revolutionary possibilities of the struggle, shifting funding and resources away from economic issues and toward the battle against Southern legal segregation. As time went on, this became a significant limit on the scope of mass mobilization. To what degree is that shift away from economic issues the end of the mass movement that was started by the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s, that had major successes with the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of 1965? Did that shift away from economic issues end the mass movement as well as the more collective and cross-cultural state of identity politics?
Well, after '65, everybody was thinking, in the civil rights movement, we have to shift economic issues now because we've achieved these formal legal victories against segregation, but segregation and racism continue to exist because of the economic structures of the society, because of the de facto segregation in the cities, because of the leadership structures, because of the sheer fact of poverty, and that's what Martin Luther King was totally preoccupied with in those last 3 years, and that's also what started to become apparent with the emergence of the urban rebellions, the riots in the inner cities of the North, and the rise of organizations like the Black Panthers and others that were taking up the slogans of Black Power. But at that point, the politics becomes complicated because having a movement against economic exploitation when these victories had been achieved at the formal legal level was a complicated prospect. They had spent over a decade building a movement against segregation in the South, and all of a sudden needed a new strategy, needed a new language, and that's what King was working on, and often butting heads with his associates in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the other organizations, the Black Power organizations, were facing extreme state repression and some of the limits of trying to take up a strategy of violent revolution that had worked in China and Cuba and so on, and applying it to the very different context of the United States. And one thing that comes out of that is that Black nationalism sort of becomes an ambiguous political force. On the one hand, it's working to create institutions that are not just trying to integrate into the white society, but trying to provide a parallel structure for Black people who had been excluded. And for a certain period, that is something that unites the more elite members of the Black community with the mass of the Black community. But slowly, as a kind of integration of society takes place, especially at the elite level, as Black mayors are elected, as Black businessmen begin to rise, these interests are no longer in alignment. And so what you find in the 70s is that as neoliberal restructuring is happening, many black politicians are the ones who are imposing austerity on their own constituencies. And the idea of racial unity that came out of black nationalism is now, in this context, a kind of obstacle to seeing that antagonism. And so this is something that many participants in the black nationalist movements recognize. For example, Amiri Baraka, who I go into in the book, he faced this situation specifically in Newark. And that's what caused him to make this conversion from black nationalism, from cultural nationalism specifically, to Marxism in the early 70s.
You write on this lack of liberation and just replacing a white cop with a black cop, which I found you write how you're setting up a situation in which the white cop would be replaced by a black cop. For the Black Panthers, this was not liberation. On this lack of liberation, just replacing a white cop with a black cop, you write, that was clearly the situation we were getting into in the United States, as optimistic liberals celebrated the replacement of mass movements, riots, and armed calls with a placid multiculturalism. Over the course of several decades, the legacy of anti-racist movements was channeled toward the economic and political advancement of individuals like Barack Obama and Bill Cosby, who would go on to lead the attack against social movements and marginalized communities. How did Barack Obama lead an attack against social movements and marginalized communities?
Well, Bill Cosby actually came first with what was known as the pound cake speech, going around speaking to black communities in various places and talking about how the responsibility for the racial inequalities that exist in American society lay with the culture of black communities. And it's the kind of thing that says, pull your pants up, etc. And Obama did that himself with what was called the Popeye speech, in which he said, he speaking to a black audience, said, you can't be feeding your children cold Popeyes for breakfast. Well, in both cases, that's the kind of colonial mentality which says that the people who have been exploited and subjugated for so long are themselves responsible for their position because of the inadequacy of their own culture and practices. And that just sort of is an illustration of how the rise of an individual black politician doesn't lead to the overcoming of the structures of racism in a very direct way, in the sense that he himself went out and adopted this racist rhetoric, and he should be held responsible for that.
You write, quote, in an analysis of the murder of Freddie Gray and the ensuing uprising in Baltimore, past guest on our show, Keeanga Yamada Taylor, writes in her book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. Actually, she argues we have broken in a fundamental way from the context that produced the classical vocabulary of the anti-racist struggle. Then you quote her writing, there have always been class differences among African Americans, but this is the first time those class differences have been expressed in the form of a minority of blacks wielding significant political power and authority over the majority of black lives. This raises critical questions about the role of the black elite in the continuing freedom struggle and about what side are they on. This is not an overstatement when a black mayor governing a largely black city aids in the mobilization of a military unit led by a black woman to suppress a black rebellion. We're in a new period of the black freedom struggle. How much does the reaction by the city of Baltimore to the shooting of Freddie Gray reveal the failings of today's identity politics?
Well, I think what it reveals is that there has not been an adequate challenge to the structures of governance and the economic structures that are keeping these racist practices in place. The fact that you have black leadership, as we've been discussing, doesn't change the way that the lives of black people at a mass level are still fundamentally affected by the structures of racism. and that without a challenge to the authoritarianism of this society, the militarization of this society, and to the extreme economic polarization in this society, uh, it will be impossible for people to achieve any kind of social change. I mean, I think that's something that we can debate all day back and forth about identity politics, about race and gender, and so on. But the thing is, any social movement is going to ultimately have to confront the state. It's ultimately going to have to confront the way that our society is structured, so that a minority can rule and keep things the way they are. If you want to challenge the status quo, you have to challenge that. And to turn that into some kind of opposition, an opposition between race and class or something like that, is fundamentally disabling and self-defeating. So if you want to have an anti-racist movement, it has to involve a class struggle against the people who are whatever their identity, who are part of the ruling structures and who are preventing social change from happening.
You quote the author and black liberation supporter James Boggs, husband of the late, great Grace Lee Boggs, reflecting in 1993, shortly before his death. Before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we may have had the money, but we couldn't go into most hotels to buy a home outside of the ghetto. Today, the only reason why we can't go to a hotel or buy a decent home is because we don't have the money. But we are still focused on the question of race, and it is paralyzing us. What were or are the questions of race that you believe are paralyzing any black liberation movement to this day?
Well, I think it's precisely the way that it's turned into an opposition. Because Boggs was pointing out that that it's not as though Boggs was just saying now it's just about economics. Now our situation is, meaning the situation of black people in his context in Detroit, that situation is just the same as that of poor white people. It's pointing out that racism is now expressed through this economic inequality in the way that before it was expressed through laws and formal exclusion. And so now that exclusion is taking the form of economic inequality. And there is racial disparity in wealth in this country. That's fundamentally the case, and it can, and, that has to be a central that has to be centrally targeted by any social movement that wants to change the way that this country works. A labor movement, a socialist movement that is worthy of the name, is going to take that kind of racial disparity into account and is going to put it front and center. But also, a movement against racism that wants to target that racial disparity has to understand that if it's economically expressed, that also requires a movement that is operating at the level of class. They cannot be separated, and that's what that's the kind of paralyzing way of talking about race when it's turned into something that's separate from class and separate from economic structures.
You write by coding demands that come from marginal or subordinate groups as identity politics. The white male identity is enshrined with the status of the neutral, general, and universal. We know that this is false. In fact, there is a white identity politics, a white nationalism, and as we shall see, whiteness is the prototypical form of racial ideology itself. Anti-racist struggles like those of the Combahee River Collective reveal the false universality of the hegemonic identity. To what extent do today's identity politics, even unintentionally, reinforce white supremacy?
Well, I think, first of all, it's extremely illuminating to understand whiteness as one of the primary forms of race, because that shows you exactly how constructed these categories are, just how much They are not part of the expression of some individual's characteristics. All these different groups that in Europe were part of racial hierarchies, like the English and the Irish, or Germans and Poles, migrated to the United States, and over a long process, all became integrated into one entity called the white race. That's what Theodore Allen called the invention of the white race, and that's something that I quote in my book. That shows exactly how delusional the white supremacists and the alt-right are today when they talk about this category of whiteness. They're talking about a fictive construction, okay, one that is real in the sense that it has real social effects, but has no basis in human physiology or even culture, okay? And so I think that often there's a tendency to simply take what the right says and invert it and just accept the basic categories. So to respond to what the alt-right is saying by taking the category of white people and whiteness as though they are real things, that ends up reinforcing the ideological structure that they're using to put forth a highly misleading rationalization for a very dangerous political agenda. And so, once again, we have to be able to question the racial ideology, these empty abstractions of race, and that applies to whiteness first and foremost.
And you were talking earlier, and you write about how identity politics leads to a victimhood and reduces us and reduces people to that victimized belonging. Yet we see claims of being discriminated against and victimhood on the far right. And according to a poll recently done last October, I believe, by NPR, a majority of white Americans feel they are discriminated against. Do whites on the far right who claim victimhood also face the possibility of being defined by its victimhood and reduced to that victimized belonging? And if so, what does that mean for the white race?
Well, first of all, I'll say on the question of victimhood, when I criticize a political discourse that's based on victimhood, this is not like the conservative kind of grandfatherly thing, like, don't see yourself as a victim or stop whining, etc. No, this is from a very different perspective. This perspective is that if we understand ourselves politically as victims, that means that our politics is reduced to asking for protection from the state. But if we understand ourselves fundamentally as engaged as political agents who are capable of engaging in resistance, that's a very different kind of politics. That's the kind of politics that can actually lead to emancipation, that can actually lead to changing society. Claiming victimhood and asking for protection will not change the existing structure of society. Now, of course, when the alt-right and the various kinds of white supremacists we have today claim the status of victimhood, they are being cynical. When I don't know who exactly was polled with the numbers you cited, but we can presume that a lot of those people are sort of unable to conceive of a way to think about politics outside of asking the state for protection, outside of asking the state for some kind of redress of their grievances. Now, if there are poor white people or also middle-class white people who have found that their standard of living has declined, they've become more precarious, I think they're often going to reach for that kind of claim, that they are victims, and they're going to have a distorted understanding that they're the victims of immigrants or black people or gay people or transgender people or whatever other group happens to be targeted in the media that they're getting these ideas from. Instead of understanding that actually what's happened is an objective political historical process in which the ruling elite has changed their conditions of life. And so, with the alt-right, they're using it cynically. They should be destroyed. With more mainstream people who are confused, they need to be re-educated, and they need to understand that anti-racism is in their interest, and that's something that a lot of today's identity politics won't accept, because it's fundamentally lodged in a moralizing kind of discourse. The thing is that the vast majority of white people, whether they voted for Trump, whatever, they need to be re-educated. They can't just be. It may feel satisfying just to condemn them, but if we actually want to overcome racism, we have to deal with the fact that a huge proportion of this society is constantly reproducing white supremacy, even sometimes on an unconscious level, and they need to be re-educated into opposing racism. And they also need to be recruited into an anti-capitalist program, and that's ultimately going to have to be the same thing.
We have been speaking with Asad Haider. He is author of Mistaken Identity, Race and Class in the Age of Trump. Asad is a founding editor of Viewpoint Magazine, an investigative journal of contemporary politics, and you should definitely find it online, Viewpoint Magazine. It's a fantastic publication. One last question for you, Asad, and it's what we call the question from hell, the question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer, or our audience is going to hate your response. Is it possible to be a critic of identity politics and not be supporting racism or sexism? Because past guests who have been critical of identity politics have been either labeled as racist or sexist, or not realizing how much racism and sexism are still prevalent today. So can you both be a critic of identity politics and not be racist or sexist?
It depends, because it depends on how you understand the term. And some people ask me, well, why did you frame your argument as a critique of identity politics instead of reclaiming its radical potential? And that's the particular strategic decision that I made, a particular critical decision that I made, because I think that now the term has become so unstable that we can't just reassert its origins. I think I want to bring attention to its origins to show people that a different kind of politics was possible, and that there was a very valuable, revolutionary kind of contribution to American politics that was made by the people who put forth this term. The way that it's used now is not anchored in that original usage, and there's something here that's happening now that we have to criticize. And if we're going to criticize that, I believe, and I think this is fundamental, it must be done from a perspective that is anti-racist and feminist. And it must be done from the perspective of saying, what is the most useful way of thinking and the most useful way of acting that can oppose racism and sexism? And is identity politics, in the way that it currently exists, in the way that people use these terms, is that actually useful for those goals? And I think that in terms of its current usage, it is not. And that's why I choose to criticize it. If someone criticizes it because they think that at some abstract level, class matters more than race, or that we have to prioritize sameness over difference or something like that, then I think there's a strong likelihood that the critique will be racist and sexist. But I think if the critique starts from the perspective that we need an adequate language for opposing racism and sexism, is this an adequate language? Then that can be a constructive and valuable critique, which I hope I have aspired to do.
Our guest has been Asad Haider. He is author of Mistaken Identity, Race and Class in the Age of Trump. Thank you so much for being on This Is Hell this week, Asad.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.